Dawn broke slowly over Eastern Europe, pale and cold, as if the sun itself hesitated to rise. Frost clung to the bare trees. The earth was hard, silent, waiting. Somewhere beyond the distant hills, an empire was moving. The Ottoman Empire did not arrive like a rumor. It came like a shadow that swallowed the horizon. By the winter of 1474, the people of Eastern Europe had learned to read the signs. Roads crowded with refugees, churches filled with whispered prayers, smoke rising where villages once stood. When the Ottomans marched, the land felt it before the people saw it. Cold winds swept across the plains of Moldavia, cutting through cloaks and bone. Farmers paused in their fields. Shepherds stared toward the south. Mothers pulled children closer. Everyone knew what stood beyond those borders. An empire that had already crushed cities, shattered kingdoms, and bent nations to its will. For more than a century, the Ottomans had been moving west, one battle at a time. Constantinople had fallen in 1453, its great walls broken, its churches turned into mosques, its people silenced or scattered. That single moment sent a message across Europe that needed no translation. If Constantinople could fall, anyone could. The Ottomans were not just conquerors. They were a system, a machine of war powered by discipline, experience, and numbers that few could match. Their soldiers had marched across deserts, mountains, and rivers. They had crushed crusader armies. They had taken cities thought to be untakeable. And when resistance failed, punishment followed. Villages that resisted were burned. Men were killed. Women and children were taken away in chains, forced into slavery or service. Entire regions learned that defiance came at a terrible price. So most chose submission, pay the tax, bow to the Sultan, live another year. But Moldavia was small, poor, and dangerously close. Nestled between powerful neighbors, Moldavia sat like a fragile shield between the Ottoman world and the heart of Christian Europe. It had no massive cities, no endless gold, no vast armies, just forests, rivers, and people who had survived by being forgotten. That was about to change. Word traveled fast in winter. Ottoman banners had been sighted. Scouts spoke of tens of thousands of soldiers gathering. Veterans hardened by decades of war. Cavalry that moved like lightning. Infantry that advanced without fear. This was not a raid. This was punishment. For years, Moldavia had lived on borrowed time, paying tribute when forced, resisting when possible, balancing survival between submission and defiance. But now, the empire was done waiting. In villages across the countryside, life slowed to a quiet dread. Blacksmiths worked late into the night, turning farming tools into crude weapons. Priests walked muddy roads, offering blessings they weren't sure would be answered. Old men spoke of past invasions, their voices low, their eyes distant. Everyone knew the truth, even if no one said it out loud. If the Ottomans crossed fully into Moldavia, there would be no mercy. The empire had reasons for this march. Moldavia had refused full obedience. Its ruler had challenged Ottoman authority, interfered with their influence, and dared to act like a free prince in a world where freedom was expensive. And empires do not forgive defiance. Far to the south, the Ottoman army gathered under experienced commanders. Tents stretched as far as the eye could see. Drums echoed through frozen nights. Fires burned without fear, because this was an army that believed victory was already decided. They had the numbers. They had the weapons. They had the reputation. What could a small, forested land possibly do? In Moldavia, there was no illusion of strength. The people knew they were outnumbered. They knew they were poorer. They knew Europe was far away, divided, slow to act. And yet, something else spread alongside fear. Resolve. Moldavia had been shaped by hardship. Its people lived close to the land, close to hunger, close to death. They knew how to endure winters that killed the unprepared. They knew forests that could hide entire armies. They knew rivers that could become traps instead of barriers. Survival was not new to them. Still, the fear was real. Mothers packed what little they could carry. Children were warned to stay quiet if soldiers came. Villages discussed where to flee. Deeper into forests, toward mountains, anywhere the horses might struggle to follow. And always the same question hung in the air. Would anyone stand against the empire? History had taught them the answer was usually no. Across Europe, rulers had learned that open resistance often led to ruin. Kingdoms fell. Thrones vanished. Cities were erased. The Ottomans did not need to conquer hearts, only land. And yet, Moldavia's fate was not sealed by fear alone. At the center of this growing storm stood a man who understood exactly what was coming, and refused to run. Stephen, Prince of Moldavia, did not see the approaching empire as an abstract threat. He saw villages, faces, names. He knew what defeat meant because he had seen its aftermath elsewhere. Submission might save lives in the short term, but it would kill something deeper: identity, independence, memory. As winter tightened its grip, Stephen watched the borders, aware that the empire at his door did not just want land. It wanted obedience, silence, and time. Time to move farther west. Time to erase another small nation from history. For the Ottomans, Moldavia was just another step. For Moldavia, it was everything. The cold winds carried more than snow that year. They carried the weight of an approaching decision that would shape generations. Fight and risk annihilation, or kneel and live under a shadow forever. In the nights before the invasion, fires burned low across the countryside. Families gathered close, sharing stories not of glory, but of endurance. Of ancestors who survived invasions before. Of forests that protected them. Of faith that remained when armies came and went. They did not speak of victory. They spoke of survival. And somewhere beyond the frozen valleys, the Ottoman army began to move. Boots crushed frost. Horses breathed steam into the air. Standards were raised. Orders were given. The empire was coming. Not as a test. Not as a warning. But as a final demand. By the time the snow began to fall heavier, Moldavia stood on the edge of history. A small land facing a force that had crushed giants. What happened next would decide whether Moldavia would become another forgotten province, or a name remembered in whispers and bells across Europe. As the wind howled through the forests and the earth froze beneath marching feet, one truth became clear: empires do not knock politely. They arrive to be obeyed or resisted, and Moldavia was about to choose. Morning came without warmth. A thin gray light crept over the hills of Suceava, slipping through bare branches and broken clouds. The fortress walls stood cold and quiet, their stones dark with age and weather. Inside those walls, a man was already awake. Not from comfort, but from burden. Stephen of Moldavia did not wake like a king protected by distance. He woke like a man who knew every scream a war could bring. He stood alone near a narrow window, looking out at the frozen land. Snow had fallen again in the night, softening the roads, hiding tracks, swallowing sound. To many it looked peaceful. To Stephen it looked like a shroud. He knew what lay beyond the borders. He knew the size of the force moving toward him. He knew the history because history had hunted his family before it hunted his people. Stephen had not inherited a peaceful throne. He had fought for it. Years earlier, his father had been killed in betrayal. Moldavia had torn itself apart with rival claimants, foreign influence, and shifting loyalties. Stephen survived not because he was the strongest, but because he learned early that trust was dangerous, and mercy could be fatal. When he finally became prince in 1457, Moldavia was weak, surrounded, watched, pressured by Hungary, Poland, and the Ottomans alike. Every decision mattered. Every mistake echoed. Stephen learned to rule like a man standing on thin ice. Pay tribute when necessary. Fight when possible. Delay when needed. Never show fear. But the Ottoman Empire was not satisfied with balance. It demanded submission, full and final. A prince who ruled only because the Sultan allowed it. Stephen refused. That refusal was not loud. It was not dramatic. It was quiet, stubborn, and dangerous. He missed payments. He challenged Ottoman-backed rulers. He interfered in nearby regions. Small acts of defiance, the kind that told an empire you were not afraid, or worse, that you were willing to die standing. and empires notice that kind of silence. Inside the fortress, Stephen gathered his council. These were not men of comfort or luxury. They were scarred veterans, nobles hardened by border wars, priests who had buried entire villages. They spoke plainly. "The Ottomans are coming," one said. "We cannot match them," another replied. "No one will come in time," a third whispered. Stephen listened. He always did. He knew the numbers. Everyone did. Estimates spoke of an army larger than Moldavia had ever faced. Tens of thousands. Soldiers trained since childhood. Commanders who had crushed stronger kingdoms. This was not pride versus pride. This was survival versus erasure. Some urged submission. "Pay them," they said. "Kneel now, live later. Save the people," they begged. A dead nation remembers nothing. Stephen did not answer immediately. He looked at the men before him, men who had lost sons, brothers, fathers. Men who knew exactly what submission meant under Ottoman rule. Taxes that bled the poor dry. Boys taken from their families, raised to fight for the empire that enslaved them. Churches watched. Traditions erased slowly, quietly. Submission saved bodies, killed futures. Stephen finally spoke, his voice calm but heavy. "If we kneel now," he said, "we kneel forever." The room fell silent. Stephen was not blind to fear. He felt it every night. He knew Moldavia could burn. He knew defeat might mean his death, slow or public. But he also knew something else. If he ran, there would be nowhere left to run to. Moldavia did not have endless plains like Hungary. It did not have powerful allies waiting with armies ready. If Stephen fled or surrendered, the people would face the empire alone. And Stephen had already seen what that looked like. He had walked through villages emptied by war. He had seen churches turned into stables. He had watched mothers beg soldiers to take anything but their children. Those memories hardened him. "I will not leave," he told his council. "And I will not kneel." The decision spread fast. In castles, in monasteries, in villages pressed against the forests. Stephen the Great would fight, not because victory was guaranteed, but because surrender was final. Across Moldavia, messengers rode through snow and mud. Orders were given, beacons prepared, food stores counted, weapons gathered. Stephen did not promise glory. He did not speak of honor in distant terms. He spoke of home. "This is our land," his message carried. "Our rivers, our graves. No one else will defend it." Men answered, not as a grand army but as farmers, hunters, shepherds. Men who knew the land better than any map. Men who had little to lose but everything to protect. They did not come with shining armor. They came with patched cloaks and scarred hands, with fear in their eyes and loyalty in their bones. Stephen walked among them. He ate what they ate, slept where they slept, listened to their worries without pretending they were small. He prayed with them too. Stephen was deeply religious, but not blindly so. His faith did not promise safety, it demanded responsibility. If God had placed him here at this moment, then turning away would be the real sin. Church bells rang across Moldavia, not in celebration, but in warning. Priests spoke of endurance, not miracles, of sacrifice, not easy salvation. Winter tightened its grip. The Ottomans were closer now. Scouts brought reports of marching columns, endless tents, drums that echoed through valleys, fires that burned without fear, confidence sharpened by centuries of victory. Ottoman commanders believed Moldavia would break quickly. Small lands always did. What they did not see was the forest watching them back. Stephen knew he could not win a straight fight. He was not foolish. He did not plan to meet the empire on open ground like a challenge of pride. Instead, he prepared the land itself. Bridges weakened, wells poisoned, roads blocked, villages evacuated and burned, not by the enemy, but by Moldavians denying resources. It was a cruel strategy, necessary. Every empty village was a wound Stephen carried personally. But starvation and confusion could break what swords could not. At night, Stephen returned to his chamber, alone again with the cold walls. He thought of his father, of betrayal, of blood spilled by men who bowed too easily. He wondered how history would remember him, as a hero or as a fool. History, he knew, was written by survivors. By the time the first Ottoman units crossed into Moldavian land, the choice had already been made. Stephen the Great would not kneel. He would not run. He would stand between his people and the empire, even if it meant being crushed beneath it. And as snow continued to fall across the forests and valleys, Moldavia followed its prince into the dark, not with certainty, but with resolve. Because sometimes the most dangerous thing a small nation can do is refuse to bow. Night fell early in Moldavia that winter. The sun slipped behind the hills before most work was done, leaving villages wrapped in long blue shadows. Smoke rose from chimneys, thin and quiet, as families gathered indoors. Doors were barred sooner than usual. Voices were lowered. Even the dogs seemed to sense something coming. Fear has a sound, and that season it whispered everywhere. In the countryside, word spread faster than any rider could travel. The Ottomans were near, not rumors anymore, not distant threats. Scouts had seen them. Refugees had passed through, hollow-eyed, speaking of endless soldiers and black banners moving like a tide. For the people of Moldavia, invasion was not an idea. It was memory. Older men remembered past raids, sudden violence, villages emptied overnight, fields left to rot. Women remembered hiding children in forests, praying the soldiers would pass by. Children grew up hearing stories meant to scare them into obedience, now becoming real. This time felt different. This time, the empire was coming in force. Across the land, life changed its rhythm. Fields were left half-harvested. Grain was buried or hidden. Livestock driven into forests or slaughtered early so the enemy could not take them. Every choice carried pain. To abandon a home was to accept it might never be seen again. To burn a village before the enemy arrived was to destroy generations of memory with one match. Yet people did it anyway, because survival demanded it. In one small village near the Prut River, a mother packed what she could into a single cart. A blanket, a pot, a wooden cross worn smooth by years of prayer. Her children watched silently as their father nailed the door shut, not to protect the house, but to mark it as already lost. Down the road, an old man refused to leave. He sat on a bench outside his home, wrapped in a threadbare cloak, staring at the trees. "I was born here," he said quietly. "If they come, they will find me here." Some choices were not about survival. They were about dignity. Stephen's orders had reached every corner of Moldavia. Evacuate border villages, deny the enemy supplies, vanish into the land. It was smart, necessary, but it hurt. Soldiers tasked with enforcing these orders often knew the people they displaced. Cousins, friends, former neighbors. They avoided eye contact as houses were emptied, as flames rose into the winter sky. Each burning village was a message to the Ottomans. There will be nothing here for you. The forests became crowded. Families slept beneath trees, huddled together against the cold. Children cried until exhaustion claimed them. Fires were kept small, hidden, their smoke carefully watched. Moldavia had always lived close to its forests. Now the forests became its shield. Priests moved among the refugees, offering words they barely believed themselves. Faith was all many had left. Some prayed for victory. Others prayed simply to be spared. And some prayed for death to come quickly if it had to come at all. As fear spread among the people, tension grew among the soldiers. These were not professional armies. They were men pulled from fields and workshops, carrying the weight of their family's safety on their backs. Every rumor felt heavier than the last. They say the Ottomans skin prisoners alive. They say they take children first. They say no one survives. Stephen knew fear could destroy an army before a single sword was drawn. So he moved constantly. He rode through camps and forest clearings, speaking not of victory, but of purpose. He reminded them why they were here, not to die for a prince, but to protect their homes, their families hiding just beyond the trees. They will not fight for gold, he told his captains. They will fight for what they love. Still doubt lingered. At night, around low fires, soldiers whispered. Some wondered if kneeling now would still save lives. Others feared betrayal. A noble opening gates, a guide selling secrets. Moldavia's history had taught them that enemies did not always wear foreign clothes. Stephen feared that too. He knew loyalty under pressure could crack. He watched carefully, trusted slowly, punished quickly when needed. Mercy was a luxury he could not afford. Meanwhile, the Ottomans advanced. Their movement was steady, deliberate. Villages already emptied offered no resistance. Roads led them deeper into Moldavian territory, where the land narrowed, darkened, and grew unfamiliar. They expected submission. Instead, they found silence. No welcoming no supplies. No open towns to loot. Just abandoned homes, poisoned wells, and forests that seemed to watch them. Ottoman soldiers grew uneasy. They were used to resistance or surrender, not disappearance. Commanders dismissed the fear. The land will break, they said. It always does. But the land did not break. It waited. Fog rolled in thick during the mornings, clinging to valleys and marshes. Sound carried strangely. A snapped branch could feel like an ambush. A distant horn could mean anything. Small Moldavian units harassed the edges of the Ottoman army. Quick attacks, then gone. No banners. No clear targets. Just enough blood to remind them they were not alone. Each night, Ottoman soldiers slept armed. Each night, Moldavian refugees listened for screams. In the capital and major towns, churches remained open day and night. Candles burned constantly, dripping wax like tears onto stone floors. People knelt until their legs went numb, praying not just for survival, but for meaning. Why this land? Why now? Why us? There were no answers. Stephen felt the weight of every prayer. He knew that if Moldavia fell, history would not linger on its pain. It would become a footnote, another small land swallowed by a greater power. That knowledge sharpened him. He ordered scouts deeper into enemy territory, learned their numbers, their formations, their habits. He watched how they moved through valleys, how their horses struggled in mud and snow. The empire was powerful, but it was not invincible. Not everywhere. Not always. As winter deepened, the land itself began to fight back. Roads turned to sludge. Wagons broke. Horses slipped. Supply lines stretched thin. The Ottomans were strong, but they were far from home. And Moldavia belonged to those who knew its moods. Still, the human cost grew. Disease spread among refugees. Children grew weaker. Old people did not survive the cold nights beneath trees. Graves were shallow, marked with sticks, frozen earth resisting every shovel. Stephen visited one such camp and said nothing. There were no words that could heal that pain. He only knelt, pressed his forehead to the ground, and stayed. For some, that was enough. As the days passed, fear and resolve twisted together into something harder. A quiet acceptance. If death was coming, it would be met standing. The shadows over Moldavia deepened, not just from winter clouds, but from the knowledge that the moment of collision was near. The empire was inside their borders now. The land had been stripped bare. The people were hidden. The prince was ready. All that remained was the meeting, where silence would end and blood would speak. And in the forests, beneath snow-heavy branches, Moldavia held its breath. The ground trembled before the soldiers were seen. Deep in the forests of Moldavia, birds lifted suddenly from bare branches. Snow slid from pine needles. The earth itself seemed to listen, then recoil. Somewhere beyond the hills, thousands of boots struck frozen soil in slow, measured rhythm. The Ottoman army was coming in full. At the head of this force was not a reckless raider, but the iron will of an empire. This was the Sultan's hammer, an army assembled not just to defeat Moldavia, but to make an example of it. The Ottomans did not march in chaos. They advanced with discipline sharpened by centuries of conquest. Rows of infantry moved like a dark river, shields locked, spears upright. Cavalry flanked them, Horse and rider trained to strike fast and disappear just as quickly. Drums beat steadily, not to inspire courage, but to impose order. Every sound carried authority. For many of these soldiers, Moldavia was just another name on a map, another cold land that would soon learn the cost of defiance. They had marched through far worse. Hot deserts, mountain passes, fortified cities that screamed before they fell. This place would be no different. Their commanders believed this deeply. The Sultan had not come himself, but his command was absolute. The army was led by experienced generals, men who had crushed rebellions and humbled kings. They carried the weight of imperial expectation, and the certainty that failure was not an option. Behind them stretched long supply trains, wagons heavy with food, weapons, and chains. This was not an army passing through. This was an army prepared to stay, to punish, to reshape a land by force. As they crossed into Moldavia, the silence unsettled them. No envoys came. No hostages were offered. No tribute wagons rolled forward in surrender. Villages stood empty, doors swinging in the wind, hearths cold. To some, it felt wrong. To the commanders, it felt like weakness. "Let them hide," one reportedly said. "They will crawl out when they are hungry." But hunger cuts both ways. The deeper the Ottomans marched, the more the land resisted them. Wells were fouled, food stores destroyed, bridges collapsed under the weight of wagons. Roads narrowed into forest paths where horses slowed and formations stretched thin. Soldiers cursed the cold, the mud, the endless trees. This was not how empires preferred to fight. Still, their confidence remained. They had numbers Moldavia could not imagine matching. Tens of thousands of soldiers against a land barely able to raise a fraction of that. In open battle, this would be a slaughter. They expected Stephen to understand this. Every empire believes its power is obvious. As Ottoman scouts pushed forward, they began to encounter resistance. Brief, violent, and confusing. Arrows from nowhere. Horns echoing in fog. Small units striking supply lines, then vanishing. Never enough to slow the army, just enough to make them angry. The commanders ordered reprisals. Any remaining villages were burned. Anyone found was killed or taken. Fear was a weapon they had used successfully many times before. But fear had already done its work here, and driven the people away. The hammer swung and found only air. Meanwhile, Stephen watched. From hidden ridges, from forest clearings, from muddy riverbanks. His scouts tracked every movement, counted every unit, noted where the Ottomans struggled, where they grew careless, where arrogance replaced caution. Stephen did not hate the Ottoman soldiers. Hate clouded judgment. He feared the system they served, an empire that crushed resistance until obedience felt natural. He knew this army was strong, but he also knew something it lacked: patience. The Ottomans were used to breaking enemies quickly. Surround, overwhelm, move on. Moldavia refused to give them that satisfaction. As days passed, frustration crept into the ranks. Soldiers complained about food, about cold nights, about invisible enemies who never stood and fought. Drums still beat, orders were still given, but the confidence began to crack at the edges. The land felt cursed. Fog thickened without warning. Marshes swallowed horses whole. Forest paths twisted until even guides lost direction. Sounds echoed strangely, turning small movements into imagined threats. Men slept poorly. Some spoke of omens, others of witchcraft. Superstition grew where certainty failed. Ottoman commanders pushed harder. They wanted battle, a decisive strike, a place where Moldavia could be crushed publicly, undeniably. They believed Stephen would eventually be forced to stand. And they were right. Stephen knew he could not hide forever. Delay weakened the Ottomans, but only to a point. At some moment, steel would meet steel. The question was where and when. As the army moved toward the region near Vaslui, the land narrowed into valleys and marshlands. Rivers overflowed with meltwater. The ground softened under snow and rain. Stephen's eyes lingered on this place. Here the hammer might crack. Ottoman scouts reported strange activity. Horns heard in fog, fires lit then extinguished, movement without contact. Felt like being watched. Because they were. Stephen allowed the Ottomans to believe they were finally close to the Moldavian army. He let small units show themselves, retreating deliberately, drawing the enemy forward. The Ottomans took the bait. They believed the time for decisive battle had come. This belief restored their confidence. Officers spoke of glory, of swift victory, of returning home with stories of crushing another stubborn prince. They underestimated the cold. They underestimated the land. They underestimated a man who had already accepted the cost of failure. The hammer was raised high, but it was swinging into a trap built not from stone, but from patience, sacrifice, and deep knowledge of home. As the Ottoman army camped near Vaslui, fires burned bright against the snow. Drums echoed once more. Soldiers laughed, sharpened blades, and spoke of the coming fight. They believed this would end quickly. In the forests beyond their camp, Moldavian soldiers waited in silence. Cloaks white with snow, breath slow, weapons ready. They did not cheer. They did not celebrate. They prepared. Because they knew what the Ottomans did not. Empires are powerful when they strike freely. But when a hammer falls in the wrong place, it can shatter itself. And as night settled over the valley, thick with fog and cold, the Sultan's hammer hovered in the dark, moments away from impact, unaware that the land beneath it was about to give way. Snow fell softly that night, muffling the world. In the forests and valleys of Moldavia, men sat close to small fires, their faces half lit, half lost in shadow. No one spoke loudly. Even laughter felt dangerous now. The enemy was too close, the moment too heavy. This was the night before history turned. Across the land, churches remained awake. Candles burned without pause, their flames trembling in the cold air. Stone walls echoed with whispered prayers, not shouted ones. These were not prayers for glory. They were prayers for survival, for courage, for forgiveness, for strength to face what dawn would bring. Stephen moved between both worlds, camp and church, sword and prayer. He wore no crown, no rich armor, just a heavy cloak, stiff with frost, and the weight of a decision already made. He knew the Ottomans would attack soon. He knew Vaslui would be the place where everything ended one way or another. This was not a moment for speeches meant to inspire legends. This was a moment for honesty. Stephen gathered his captains under the cover of trees, maps spread over frozen ground. He traced the valley with his finger, the marshes, the narrow paths, the forests that pressed in like walls. "This land will fight for us," he said quietly, "if we let it." They discussed every detail, where the enemy would advance, where the ground would slow them, where sound would carry and where it would vanish into fog. Stephen ordered horns placed deep in the forests, not to signal movement, but to create confusion. He ordered fires lit in false camps, then extinguished. Units were assigned not to fight, but to retreat convincingly. Everything had a purpose, even sacrifice. Some villages near Vaslui were abandoned entirely, their last supplies destroyed. Fields were trampled, paths altered. It was a brutal strategy, and Stephen knew the cost would be paid by his own people long after the battle. But if Moldavia lost tomorrow, there would be no future to rebuild. Among the soldiers, fear sat heavy. These were not men trained for distant wars. They were defending their soil, the only soil they had ever known. Many had kissed their children goodbye without knowing if they would ever return. Stephen walked among them, stopping often, speaking quietly. He did not promise survival. He did not promise victory. He promised meaning. "If we fall," he told them, "we fall so they cannot pass easily. If we stand so our children may stand later." That was enough. Some men crossed themselves. Others stared into the fire, lost in thought. A few wept quietly, ashamed of tears they could not stop. No one mocked them. Fear was shared here. As dawn approached, priests moved through the ranks, blessing weapons, foreheads, hands. Some soldiers confessed sins they had carried for years. Others simply asked to be remembered if they did not return. Faith became armor where steel was thin. Stephen himself knelt in a small wooden church before sunrise. Alone, he prayed not for victory, but for clarity, for the strength to accept whatever outcome God allowed. He knew that if Moldavia survived, it would not be because of him alone, and if it fell, the blame would be his to carry forever. When he rose, his face was calm. Outside, fog rolled thick into the valley. It was perfect. The Moldavian army took its positions quietly, melting into forest and marsh. Horn-bearers moved deep into hidden paths. Archers waited with frozen fingers, bows wrapped to keep them dry. Infantry stood behind natural barriers, knowing their role was not to charge, but to hold. Stephen placed himself where he could see the valley clearly. He did not intend to hide. As the first light crept over Vaslui, the Ottomans began to move. Their horns sounded confident. Their formations advanced steadily into the fog. To them, it felt like destiny finally catching up with a stubborn land. They believed the Moldavians were ahead, retreating, frightened, ready to break. They did not see the trap closing. As Ottoman soldiers entered the marshland, the ground betrayed them. Horses slipped, wagons stalled, formations stretched and bent, losing their perfect shape. Then the horns sounded, not from one direction, from everywhere. Deep, echoing blasts rolled through the fog, bouncing off trees and hills. To the Ottomans, it sounded like an army 10 times larger than expected, surrounding them completely. Confusion spread instantly. Where are they? How many are there? Hold formation. Orders collided. Units turned to face imagined threats. Men shouted into the fog, unable to see more than a few steps ahead. Then the arrows came, silent at first, then screaming through the air. They struck horses, officers, soldiers packed too tightly to move. Panic rippled through the ranks. Still, the Ottomans tried to advance. That was when Moldavian infantry emerged, not charging wildly but striking precisely, then withdrawing. The land slowed pursuit. Mud swallowed boots. Ice betrayed balance. The Ottomans were strong, but strength meant little without order. Stephen watched as the valley filled with noise and blood. He gave signals sparingly, letting confusion do most of the work. This was not a battle of pride. It was a battle of endurance. Fate met preparation. Fear met patience. The Ottomans tried to regroup, but every movement felt wrong. Every sound felt threatening. Their numbers became a weakness, clogging paths and marshes, turning escape into chaos. By midday, the valley was a nightmare. Snow mixed with blood. Fog thickened again. Moldavian horns never stopped, always sounding from somewhere new. The Ottomans began to break. Some units fled. Others fought blindly. Commanders shouted themselves hoarse, trying to restore control that no longer existed. Stephen did not chase recklessly. He waited. When the moment came, when the Ottoman army truly lost its center, Stephen ordered the final push. Moldavian forces surged forward, not as a mob, but as a wall driven by desperation and purpose. The empire's hammer cracked at last. By the time the fog began to lift, the valley told its story. Bodies lay scattered across marsh and field, weapons abandoned, banners trampled into mud. The once mighty force was in full retreat. It was real. Against all odds, Moldavia was winning. As the Ottomans fled, chased by terrain more than men, Stephen stood still, breathing hard, staring at the cost carved into the land. Victory did not feel like celebration. It felt like survival paid for in blood. As night fell again over Vaslui, fires burned once more, this time over the fallen. Moldavian soldiers knelt beside friends who would never rise. Priests whispered final prayers. Tears froze on cheeks before they could fall. Stephen removed his cloak and knelt in the mud, not as a prince, but as a man who knew that faith, fear, and preparation had saved his people and scarred them forever. The empire had been stopped, but the price had been written into the snow. Morning returned to Vaslui slowly, as if the land itself was reluctant to wake. A pale sun pushed through thinning fog, revealing what the night had hidden. The valley lay frozen and scarred, marshland torn by boots and hooves, snow-stained dark where blood had soaked too deep to fade. Broken spears jutted from the ground like grave markers. Shields lay half-buried in mud and ice. This was no longer just a place on a map. It was a wound. The cold bit harder now. Not the clean cold of untouched winter, but the heavy chill that settles after violence. Breath hung in the air as Moldavian soldiers moved carefully through the valley, stepping around the fallen, searching for the living. Some Ottoman soldiers still breathed. Young faces stared upward in shock, eyes wide, hands trembling. A few begged softly in languages their captors barely understood. Others clutched wounds in silence, already knowing it was over. Stephen walked among them. He did not smile. He did not celebrate. Victory here was not clean. It was earned through deception, terrain, and the willingness to let the land consume an enemy. Stephen understood that history might call this clever, or cruel. To him, it was necessary. The frozen valley had been chosen carefully. Long before steel met flesh, Stephen had studied this place. How fog gathered, how water pooled beneath thin ice, how sound traveled unevenly. He knew that numbers meant little where movement was impossible and fear spread faster than commands. The Ottomans had marched into Vaslui believing they were entering open ground. Instead, they entered a cage. As the fog lifted fully, the scale of the defeat became clearer. Ottoman formations had collapsed into themselves. Cavalry units lay tangled in marshes where horses had panicked and fallen. Infantry had been cut down where they stood, unable to maneuver. This was not how empires expected to lose. Moldavian soldiers stared in disbelief. Many had expected to die here. They had prepared themselves for that truth. To stand now, alive, surrounded by proof that the empire could bleed. It felt unreal. Some laughed. Some cried. Some fell to their knees, overcome. Others searched desperately for familiar faces. The cost became clearer with every step. Friends lay still in the snow. Brothers. Sons. Men who had shared fires just hours before. Victory did not return them. It only explained why they had died. Priests moved among the bodies, murmuring prayers, blessing the fallen without distinction of uniform. Death had erased sides now. Stephen stopped beside a young Moldavian soldier no older than 16. The boy's hands were still clenched around a spear, his face peaceful in a way that felt cruel. Stephen removed his cloak and placed it over the body. This victory belonged to the dead as much as the living. As the morning stretched on, reports came in. The Ottoman army was in full retreat. Units scattered, fleeing south in disorder. Many would not survive the forests or the winter. The land that had defeated them once would finish the work. Stephen gave strict orders. No reckless pursuit. No looting. No cruelty. This was not mercy for the Ottomans. It was discipline for Moldavia. He knew that an army that lost control after victory could destroy itself just as easily as it could an enemy. More than that, he knew history would be watching, if not now, then later. Empires remembered humiliation, and they answered it with fire. The frozen valley began to change purpose. Bodies were gathered. The wounded were treated where possible. Fires were built not to celebrate, but to survive another night. Moldavian soldiers shared bread and water in silence. The adrenaline faded, replaced by exhaustion that settled into bones. Hands shook not from cold, but from what they had done to survive. Many would carry this valley with them forever. Stephen gathered his captains near a broken Ottoman banner trampled into mud. It should have felt symbolic. Instead, it felt heavy. "We have won a battle," he said quietly. "Not the war." They all understood. This victory would echo far beyond Vaslui. Across Europe, bells would ring. Messengers would carry the story of a small land that had shattered a massive army. But the Ottomans would hear it too. And empires do not forgive humiliation. As the day wore on, Moldavian scouts confirmed the scale of the Ottoman losses. Thousands lay dead or missing. Equipment abandoned. Pride broken. It was one of the worst defeats the empire had suffered in decades. Yet Stephen felt no triumph. He felt time closing in. He ordered the valley cleared quickly. The land needed to heal. The army needed to move. Remaining too long would invite retaliation. As soldiers worked, the weather shifted again. Clouds gathered. Snow began to fall, slow and steady, covering blood and tracks alike. By nightfall, Vaslui looked almost peaceful once more. Nature reclaimed what men had torn apart. Stephen stood alone at the edge of the valley, watching snow erase the evidence of the day. He knew this place would be remembered, not for its beauty, but for its lesson, that even the strongest force could be undone by land, patience, and resolve. That strength was not always loud. Sometimes, it waited quietly beneath ice and fog. As darkness settled, Stephen allowed himself a moment of reflection. He thought of the villages burned, the families hiding, the men who would never return home. Victory had saved Moldavia for now, but it had also marked it. The frozen valley was not just a battlefield. It was a message. To the Ottomans, you can be stopped. To Europe, small nations are not helpless. To Moldavia itself, survival demands sacrifice. Stephen turned away from Vaslui and mounted his horse. Orders were already spreading. The army would move before dawn. There was no time to linger in history. As he rode into the falling snow, one truth followed him like a shadow. Empires remember where they are wounded, and the frozen valley of Vaslui had cut deeper than steel ever could. The land had spoken, and the world was about to listen. Dawn did not arrive with light, came with sound. A low, distant horn echoed through the fog, stretched thin by the frozen air. Then another, and another, from the hills, from the forests, from places where no soldiers stood. To the Ottomans, it felt like the valley itself was waking, and it was angry. The fog lay thick over Vaslui, heavy as a curtain drawn by unseen hands. Visibility shrank to a few steps. Shapes blurred. Distance meant nothing. Sound became unreliable, bouncing and twisting until direction lost all meaning. This was exactly how Stephen wanted it. The Ottoman army advanced cautiously now, no longer confident, but still dangerous. Veterans tightened ranks. Officers shouted orders that dissolved into the mist. Horses snorted and stamped, sensing danger long before men could name it. Some soldiers crossed themselves. Others muttered prayers in Arabic. Faith rose instinctively when certainty failed. They believed Moldavian forces were retreating deeper into the valley. They believed this was the moment to finish it. They were wrong. Stephen had planned deception not as a single trick, but as a rhythm: advance, vanish, confuse, repeat. Every movement was designed to pull the Ottomans forward, deeper into ground that refused to support their weight. Small Moldavian units appeared briefly at the edge of the fog. A flash of armor, a banner, then gone, retreating just fast enough to look panicked. Ottoman commanders saw what they wanted to see. "They are breaking," one shouted. "Press forward," another ordered, and the army moved. Boots sank into wet ground beneath thin ice. Formations tightened, then stretched as men struggled to keep pace. Wagons slowed everything behind them. The farther they advanced, the less control they had. Then the horns sounded again, this time closer, then farther, then everywhere. The sound rolled through the valley like thunder trapped in a bowl. Soldiers turned in every direction, raising shields against threats they could not see. Units collided. Commands contradicted each other. Fear crept in, not sharp and sudden, but slow and suffocating. Some Ottoman soldiers began to believe they were surrounded by an army far larger than reported. The fog helped that lie grow strong. Stephen had ordered horn bearers to move constantly, changing positions after every blast. The same few men created the illusion of thousands. Deception became a weapon sharper than steel. Then came the arrows. Not volleys, not waves, single strikes. An officer fell from his horse. A standard bearer collapsed. A horse screamed and went down, throwing riders into the mud. Every arrow carried doubt with it. Where did it come from? How many were there? Who was next? Ottoman discipline strained under the weight of uncertainty. They had been trained to face walls, charges, clear threats. They had not been trained to fight a fog. As confusion spread, Stephen gave another signal. Moldavian infantry surged forward briefly, striking hard, then retreating again. Not to hold ground, but to break confidence. To make every advance feel like a mistake. Ottoman soldiers began to hesitate. Hesitation kills armies. Some units pushed forward too far, isolated from support. Others lagged behind, afraid of what waited ahead. The army's center bent inward, compressed by fear and terrain. Commanders shouted until their voices broke. Drums beat urgently, trying to restore rhythm. But the valley swallowed sound unevenly, turning order into noise. The deception deepened. Stephen ordered fires lit briefly in the distance, then extinguished. Smoke drifted through fog, hinting at camps that were never there. Scouts returned with conflicting reports, each more alarming than the last. "We are outnumbered," one claimed. "They are everywhere," another insisted. Truth no longer mattered. Perception did. As the sun rose higher, the fog refused to lift. Cold dampness soaked cloaks and armor. Fingers numbed. Weapons slipped. Fatigue crept in unnoticed, then settled heavily. Ottoman soldiers had marched for days. They had slept poorly. They were hungry. Now they were afraid. Stephen watched from a hidden rise, his face unreadable. He did not rush. He did not give in to excitement. This battle was being won by patience. He remembered his father's death, betrayal, haste, misplaced trust. He would not repeat those mistakes. When the Ottomans attempted to regroup, Stephen struck again. Horns sounded suddenly from behind them. Panic surged. Some soldiers turned, convinced they were being cut off. Units collided. A commander's horse bolted, dragging him into chaos. The center of the army began to fracture. This was the moment Stephen had waited for. He ordered a coordinated advance. Not a reckless charge, but a tightening grip. Moldavian forces pressed from multiple directions, using terrain to block escape routes. The Ottomans tried to fight their way out, but every movement sank them deeper into mud and fear. By midday, the deception had done its work. The Ottoman army no longer knew where the enemy was or where safety lay. Some units broke and ran. Others fought blindly. The illusion of Moldavian numbers had become reality in their minds. Empires rely on certainty. Stephen destroyed it. As the fog finally began to thin, the truth emerged too late. Moldavian forces were not endless. They were disciplined, positioned, and relentless. The Ottomans had walked themselves into confusion and bloodshed. The deception was complete. Stephen gave the signal for full engagement. This time, Moldavian forces did not retreat. They advanced. What followed was not chaos, but collapse. The Ottoman line shattered under pressure it could no longer understand. Orders ceased to matter. Survival became the only goal. Men dropped weapons to run. Horses fled riderless. Banners fell into mud. The valley echoed with screams, clashing steel, and desperate prayers. Stephen moved forward with his guard, not seeking glory, but ensuring momentum did not falter. He knew that hesitation now could cost everything. By late afternoon, the battle's outcome was clear. The Ottomans were in full retreat. Deception had turned confidence into panic, numbers into liability, strength into weakness. As the last Ottoman units fled south, chased more by fear than pursuit, the fog lifted completely. The valley stood revealed, broken, bloodied, silent. Stephen removed his helmet and closed his eyes. This victory had not come from strength alone. It had come from understanding the enemy and understanding the land. Dawn had brought deception, and deception had broken an empire's will. But as Stephen looked across Vaslui, he knew one thing with certainty. Empires forgive defeat more easily than humiliation. And this deception would echo far beyond the valley. Carried by survivors, by rumors, by wounded pride. The Ottomans would remember this morning. So would history. Because sometimes the most decisive blow is not the one that strikes first, but the one that makes an enemy doubt everything they see. The valley no longer felt like land. felt alive. Mud clung to boots like hands refusing to let go. Ice cracked beneath weight, then swallowed it. Water seeped up from beneath the ground, cold and unforgiving, turning every step into a gamble. Horses screamed as they slipped, dragging men down with them. Armor, once protection, became an anchor. For the Ottomans, the earth itself had become an enemy. They had trained to fight men, not marshes. To face walls, not fog and frozen ground that betrayed every movement. Their strength, their numbers, their discipline meant nothing when the land refused to hold them. The more they struggled, the deeper they sank. Some Ottoman soldiers dropped shields just to stand. Others cut loose wagons to escape the mire, abandoning supplies meant to sustain an empire. Pride was discarded first. Survival came next. Moldavian soldiers watched this happen from higher ground and forest edges. Their breaths slow, their movements deliberate. They knew these marshes. They had crossed them since childhood, learned where the ground held firm and where it lied. They stepped lightly. The Ottomans did not. Stephen had chosen this place with brutal clarity. Vaslui was not meant to be a battlefield, it was meant to be a trap. Every frozen puddle, every hidden channel of water beneath the snow, had been studied. Now the land revealed its loyalty. Ottoman formations attempted to reorganize, but order collapsed faster than commands could be shouted. Units meant to support each other became obstacles instead. Men collided, fell, struggled to rise. Those who fell rarely stood again. Mud filled mouths. Water flooded armor. Panic spread like infection. Moldavian archers struck carefully, targeting horses first. A fallen horse blocked paths, tripped men, shattered lines. Every scream echoed louder in the valley, feeding fear. The Ottomans tried to pull back, but retreat was no easier than advance. What had seemed solid hours earlier was now churned into a sucking swamp by thousands of boots. The earth had been broken by the empire's own weight. Stephen moved through the chaos with measured intent. He did not shout wildly. Signals were clear. Horns sounded not to confuse now, but to guide Moldavian units forward, tightening pressure without overextending. He had learned long ago that victory could be lost as easily as it was gained. The Ottomans fought desperately in pockets, skilled warriors trapped by circumstances no training could overcome. Some fought until weapons broke, others until breath failed. A few surrendered, dropping to their knees in freezing water, eyes wide with disbelief. They had not expected this. Not from a small land, not from terrain, not from silence. As the hours passed, exhaustion hollowed the Ottoman ranks. Muscles cramped from cold, fingers numbed until weapons slipped free. Fear drained strength faster than any wound. The earth took more than blood, took will. Stephen saw it in their eyes, the moment when soldiers stopped thinking of orders, flags, or commanders, and thought only of escape. That moment is where battles truly end. He ordered pressure maintained, but pursuit limited. Let the land finish the work. And it did. Men ran toward what they believed was solid ground, only to vanish into icy water. Others trampled each other in narrow paths. Wagons overturned, crushing those beneath them. The empire's strength became its weakness. Too many bodies, too much weight, too little space. By early afternoon, the Ottoman army was no longer an army. It was fragments. Broken units fleeing in different directions, abandoning cohesion entirely. The marshes swallowed banners. Drums went silent. Commands ceased. The land had spoken clearly. For Moldavian soldiers, the sight was overwhelming. Some felt triumph rise in their chests, then choke. They were watching men die not just by sword, but by cold and panic. There was no honor in mud, but there was necessity. Stephen felt the cost deeply. He knew this victory would be remembered as brilliant, but it would never feel clean. The earth had turned against the Ottomans, and he had turned it. That knowledge would haunt him. As the Ottoman retreat accelerated, Moldavian units pressed one final time, driving the enemy out of the valley. Not chasing recklessly, not seeking revenge, ending it. By late afternoon, Vaslui belonged to Moldavia again. The marshes lay still, frozen over once more, as if nothing had happened. But beneath the ice were bodies, weapons, and the shattered confidence of an empire. Stephen stood on a small rise overlooking the valley. The wind cut across his face, sharp and real. He watched survivors flee south, disappearing into forests they no longer trusted. He knew they would carry stories with them, stories of fog, of horns, of land that swallowed armies. These stories would grow in the telling, and they would reach the Sultan. Around Stephen, Moldavian soldiers gathered silently. No cheers rose. No banners were lifted high. They were too tired, too aware of what had been lost. Victory had come, but it had demanded everything. As snow began to fall again, light and steady, it covered the scars slowly. Blood darkened beneath it, then vanished from sight. The earth hid its violence well. Stephen whispered a prayer, not of thanks, but of responsibility. This victory would bring consequences. He had wounded an empire deeply. Empires do not forget such wounds. But for this moment, Moldavia still stood. Because when steel was not enough, when numbers failed, the earth itself had chosen a side. And on that frozen day at Vaslui, the land remembered who belonged to it. Snow fell relentlessly that morning, turning the valley into a silent, white tomb. The fog had lifted just enough to reveal what the marshes and frozen paths had hidden overnight. But the landscape offered no comfort. It was soaked with blood. Mud and ice were no longer neutral. They were saturated with death. Thousands of men lay across the valley, fallen by arrow, spear, or sword. Some had frozen in mid-step, their faces twisted in fear. Others had collapsed quietly, exhausted by the impossible effort of staying alive. The Ottomans had expected to walk into a small, fleeing army. Instead, they had been swallowed by the land, by the fog, and by a strategy designed to make every step a choice between life and death. For Stephen, the sight was unbearable. He walked slowly along the ridge overlooking Vaslui, his breath freezing in the air, eyes scanning the valley below. Each fallen man, friend or foe, was a reminder of what had been risked to save the land. Some Moldavian soldiers moved cautiously among the wounded, offering water or prayer where they could. Others simply stared, their hands gripping weapons they did not want to touch. Survival did not feel like triumph yet. Not while the snow absorbed so much blood, turning pure white into a canvas of horror. The valley itself seemed to mourn. Trees sagged under the weight of snow, branches dripping crimson where arrows had sliced through men. Ice cracked under the footsteps of the living, exposing dark water beneath. The land that had protected Moldavia now held the dying and the dead alike. Ottoman units tried to regroup, but confusion ran deeper than any command could reach. The young soldiers who had followed orders without question now stumbled blindly through marshes, slipping into holes, sinking into mud. Officers shouted, but the valley swallowed their voices. Fear was no longer a whisper. It had become a living, suffocating presence. Moldavian archers and infantry pressed carefully from the hills and forests, striking with precision. They did not need to engage fully. Every arrow, every charge, every sudden appearance and vanishing left men trapped between terrain, terror, and steel. Panic became weaponized by environment, sharpened by strategy. Some Ottomans fought valiantly, holding small positions, but their bravery could not overcome exhaustion, fear, and the impossible terrain. Many were trampled by panicked horses or crushed by fallen wagons. Others fell to cold or blood loss, silent victims of both man and nature. Stephen moved through the chaos without raising his voice. His orders were minimal, deliberate. The Moldavian army was trained not to fight recklessly, but to use fear, land, and timing as their allies. Each unit understood that the valley was not merely a battleground, but a trap that had been designed to magnify every mistake the Ottomans made. By midday, the valley had become a nightmare. Snow and blood mixed into a thick, red sludge that trapped boots and hooves alike. Shouts and cries echoed strangely through hills and fog, disorienting the survivors. The Ottomans could see the enemy at times, then nothing. Their lines collapsed under pressure. They had become prey in a place they thought they controlled. Moldavian soldiers moved with grim determination. They had trained for this moment not to glorify violence but to defend home. Every man understood that victory meant cost. Every arrow loosed carried hope and horror in equal measure. The Ottomans began to falter visibly. Some soldiers dropped weapons in shock. Others froze in place, caught between attacking and retreating, unable to choose. Fear had overtaken strategy. Confusion had replaced command. Steel had lost meaning in the snow. Stephen watched silently from his vantage point, his heart heavy. The valley had become a crucible. The snow, once peaceful and silent, now bore witness to the human cost of resistance. He knew that history would remember the day in black and white, as a miracle or a massacre. But he also knew the truth that survival was bought with pain, and every step forward meant a life spent or lost. By late afternoon, the valley was littered with the evidence of battle. Broken weapons, abandoned standards, fallen soldiers frozen into the mud, and snow still falling steadily, hiding the tracks and cries beneath a soft, deceptive blanket. The Ottoman army was trapped between panic and terrain, their formation destroyed. Some units attempted to flee through marshes, only to vanish beneath icy water. Others fled in confusion, tripping over fallen comrades or sinking into mud. Every step forward felt like a gamble with death itself. Moldavian soldiers moved cautiously, striking only where necessary, allowing the valley to exact its own punishment. Stephen knew the snow and mud were allies today, turning fear into a weapon more effective than any arrow or blade. As evening approached, the valley fell into silence, broken only by distant groans or the soft rustling of snow. The blood-stained snow glistened dimly under the pale sun, a brutal reminder of what had been risked and what had been lost. Stephen surveyed the scene one final time, feeling the weight of every fallen man. Victory had come, but it was written in pain. The valley, once a place of land and life, had become a testament to fear, strategy, and sacrifice. The snow would hide the blood in time. The earth would absorb it, leaving only a scar for the next traveler to see. But Stephen would remember every detail, every scream, every slip, every life extinguished between fear, confusion, and steel. In the silent valley, he whispered a vow to the living and the dead alike. Moldavia would endure, and those who came against it would pay for every step taken in defiance. The valley shook, not with wind, but with disbelief. Ottoman soldiers, scattered and battered, tried to regroup. Commanders barked orders that dissolved into fog and confusion. Men looked at one another, eyes wide, faces pale beneath helmets. The army that had once marched confidently into Moldavia was unraveling before the land, the fog, and the cunning of one prince. Every step forward had become a risk, every breath a gamble. The snow, already soaked with blood, slowed movement. Horses sank into marshes. Wagons overturned.
Men tripped over bodies.
Panic spread faster than steel. The army that had once seemed unstoppable was collapsing from within. And then, in the midst of chaos, the Moldavian forces struck decisively. Stephen gave the signal, the one they had been waiting for. Horns sounded from the forests and ridges. Archers loosed volleys with precise timing. Infantry surged from hidden positions, not wildly, but like a tide filling every channel and valley. The Ottomans had nowhere to run. The trap was complete. The effect was immediate. Men abandoned formation entirely. Some fled blindly into marshes, slipping into freezing water. Others turned on their comrades in panic, tripping or colliding, their numbers now a liability. The sound of shouts, screams, and splintering would fill the valley, echoing against hills and trees. Confusion became carnage. Carnage became collapse. No one could believe it. Not the soldiers, not the commanders. An army of over 100,000 had been brought to its knees by fewer than 40,000. It seemed impossible, unreal, and yet it was happening. Moldavian soldiers pressed forward, but carefully. They did not need to slaughter every man. The valley itself punished the enemy. Mud and ice trapped the Ottomans, slowing their advance and weakening their courage. Fear had become a weapon sharper than any sword. Some officers tried to rally their men. Drums sounded. Orders were shouted. Flags were raised. But no one listened. Confidence had crumbled. Men turned, fled, or froze entirely. Their pride and training, once so formidable, had evaporated in the fog, in the mud, in the snow. By midday, the Ottoman army was in full retreat. Units that had marched with pride were now broken, fleeing south through forests and marshes, leaving behind weapons, banners, and wounded comrades. The march that had begun with certainty now ended in chaos. Every step of retreat was a struggle. Horses panicked, wagons sank, men slipped into frozen streams. Survivors clutched weapons they no longer had the strength to use. Their empire, vast and powerful, was bleeding for the first time in a long while. Stephen watched from a ridge, helmet removed, face pale but resolute. The victory was unimaginable, yes, but it was not without cost. The snow was red with blood, mud with bodies, and the cries of the wounded still filled the air. He knew that the glory of this day would never erase the human toll. Every life lost was a reminder that survival came with sacrifice. Even as the last Ottoman units fled, Moldavian soldiers did not celebrate loudly. They had survived. They had won. But they had seen enough death to know that victory always bore a shadow. Families would grieve. Husbands would never return. Children would grow up with the story of blood in the snow. Still, the battlefield belonged to Moldavia. The impossible had been achieved. Against all odds, the empire had been broken. The soldiers who survived would carry the shame and fear of defeat back to Constantinople, and the story of Vaslui would spread across Europe, whispered in awe and disbelief. Stephen moved among his men carefully, offering quiet words, steadying hands, and recognition where it was due. Every soldier understood the magnitude of what they had done, but no one pretended that the day had been easy or painless. Courage had been tested. Strategy had been executed. Survival had been demanded of every man. By evening, the valley was silent again. The fog returned slowly, covering the scars and wounds, hiding the evidence of carnage beneath a blanket of white. Fires burned faintly, used only to tend the wounded or keep frostbite at bay. The dead were gathered, the wounded tended, and the army remained vigilant. Stephen knew that while Vaslui was won, the war was far from over. The Ottomans would recover, rebuild, and return. But for now, Moldavia had achieved the unthinkable. They had shown that courage, strategy, and intimate knowledge of the land could overcome even the largest and most disciplined of empires. As the sun dipped behind the hills, Stephen allowed himself a rare moment of reflection. He thought of his men, the families they protected, and the empire that had been humbled. Victory was theirs, unearned by luck, achieved through patience, ingenuity, and sacrifice. And yet, even in triumph, he felt the weight of what had been lost. Every red-stained step of the valley told a story of fear, confusion, and steel. Every frozen body whispered the cost of defiance. History would remember Vaslui as a miracle. Stephen knew the truth. It was calculated, brutal, and human. The Ottomans had been defeated, but only because the Moldavians had endured everything: fear, exhaustion, and the relentless, merciless bite of winter. By nightfall, the valley rested. The unthinkable had been achieved. The empire had been forced to bleed, to stumble, to retreat. And the world, far beyond the valley of Vaslui, would hear the story and tremble. The impossible had happened. Moldavia had survived. Word traveled slowly in the 15th century, yet some stories could not be contained. Church bells began to ring across Eastern Europe, first in Moldavian villages, then in towns far beyond the Carpathians. The sound was urgent, uneven, a call to attention that carried both joy and warning. It was as if the continent itself had woken, startled by news that an empire thought invincible had been broken. Merchants paused in market squares, mouths open in disbelief. Travelers whispered in inns. Knights in neighboring kingdoms exchanged grim looks. Letters, carried by horse and foot, carried the same words from village to court. Vaslui. The Ottomans defeated. A small nation standing against an empire and winning. In Constantinople, the news was received like a blow to the chest. The Sultan could not hide his rage. Strategists argued. Commanders cursed. And fear crept into the conversations of those who had never doubted their might. An army that had marched confidently west now returned in pieces, humiliated. Europe had seen it, and Europe would not forget. For Moldavia, the reaction was quieter but no less profound. Villagers emerged from hiding, eyes wide at the sight of soldiers returning from the valley. They saw mud-caked armor, weapons stained with snow and blood, and faces lined with exhaustion and grief. There were no parades, no banners lifted high, only an unspoken acknowledgement. Their survival had been bought with unimaginable cost. Stephen moved among his people, listening to the whispers. Some spoke of courage, others of luck. Few understood the strategy, the patience, the intimate knowledge of land and human fear that had won the day. He did not correct them. Legends would grow and myths would follow. That was the nature of history. Church bells tolled again, this time farther west, across rivers and hills. Monasteries lit candles, not in celebration alone, but in awe and fear. Europe had heard of a victory so improbable that it seemed miraculous. And yet, it was a warning, a reminder. The Ottoman Empire could be stopped. Diplomats hurried to send envoys. Kings and princes took note, their letters formal but laden with excitement. Vaslui became more than a battle, it became a symbol. A small nation could defend itself, could challenge an empire, could change the narrative of survival in Eastern Europe. Travelers returning from Moldavia carried tales of snow-stained valleys, of forests turned into weapons, and of an army that fought not recklessly, but with cunning and patience. The Ottomans had been humiliated, yes, but more importantly, Europe had witnessed that invincibility was not guaranteed. In cities like Krakow and Prague, scholars debated what had happened. Monks wrote accounts of courage and strategy, detailing how to reign in fear had been turned into allies. Nobles read letters in dim candlelight, imagining how a prince in a distant land had outsmarted one of the greatest empires of the age. And in the towns bordering Moldavia, the people felt a quiet pride that was different from joy. It was the pride of knowing that their homeland had mattered, that their courage, their suffering, their endurance had been seen, that their defiance had echoed far beyond their forests and rivers. Stephen himself remained cautious. He knew that news travels quickly, but memory travels slowly. The Ottomans would recover. Empires never forgive humiliation. The letters of admiration and awe from Europe were welcome, yes, but they were also warnings. Every victory carried the seed of future conflict. He walked through his army's camp one evening, listening to men share stories of Vaslui. Some spoke of fear, others of determination. Many had not seen friends since dawn. Their voices trembled with exhaustion, but also with something more profound, the knowledge that they had achieved the unthinkable. The snow still lay thick over the valley, hiding blood and bodies beneath a deceptive white. To the casual observer, it might seem peaceful. To Stephen, it was a reminder. Victory here had been hard-earned, brutal, and never to be repeated lightly. European rulers, hearing of the triumph, began to weigh the implications. If a small nation could halt the march of the Ottoman Empire, what did that mean for borders, alliances, and future campaigns? If Moldavia could resist, could others do the same? Questions rippled outward, reshaping strategies and fears far beyond the battlefield. And so Vaslui became legend, not only as a battle, but as a symbol, a proof that courage, strategy, and intimate knowledge of one's land could overcome even the most formidable enemy. Letters and stories carried the tale from court to village, from monastery to market square, until even distant Europe felt the tremor of a small nation's defiance. Yet for Stephen, the bells, the letters, and the awe of Europe were bittersweet. The battlefield was quiet now, but the war was far from over. The Ottoman Empire would regroup, recover, and return. Victory, even celebrated across kingdoms, did not erase the knowledge that more blood could yet be demanded. He walked alone at dusk along the ridge overlooking Vaslui. Snow fell silently, covering the scars of battle with a fragile, fleeting peace. The valley had spoken of courage, of sacrifice, of human endurance. Europe had listened, but the price of survival was etched into every tree, every hill, every frozen puddle. Stephen whispered a quiet thought to the cold wind. History would remember Vaslui. Europe would take notice. But the true cost, the fear, the blood, the sacrifice would never be forgotten. For now, the valley rested. The empire had been humiliated. Europe had seen proof that empires could bleed. But beyond the bells and letters, the shadow of conflict lingered. The story of Vaslui was far from finished. It was a warning and a promise. The snow had stopped falling, leaving the valley of Vaslui quiet and deceptive in its serenity. Morning light revealed what the night had tried to hide. Broken banners sagged against the frozen earth. Spears and swords protruded from mud like tombstones. Horses, abandoned or dead, lay half-buried in snow. The silence was not peaceful. It was heavy, oppressive, full of the weight of lives lost and futures forever altered. Stephen rode slowly along the ridge, helmet in hand, surveying the aftermath. Victory had been claimed, but the cost was etched into every frozen step. Moldavian soldiers moved among the wounded, tending fires, sharing water, whispering prayers. Their eyes were wide, not with celebration, but with the quiet acknowledgement of survival. They had done what many said could not be done. They had stopped an empire. Yet the victory was not sweet. It was bitter. For every Ottoman soldier who fell, there was a Moldavian who would never see home again. Friends and comrades had died, some from steel, some from the freezing mud, some from exhaustion. The valley had been a crucible, and while it had proven Moldavia's courage, it had demanded an almost unbearable price. Stephen dismounted, letting his horse rest. He walked among the survivors, noting their exhaustion, their haunted faces, their trembling hands. Each man bore a story, of fear overcome, of loyalty tested, of sacrifice made for a land they barely understood in the larger scheme of empires. The Ottomans would retreat, but the shadow of revenge already loomed. The empire would recover, rebuild, and seek retribution. Victory today did not mean safety tomorrow. Stephen knew that. The Valley of Vaslui was not the end of the war. It was a moment, a single, fragile victory in a long, uncertain struggle. Europe had taken notice. Messengers had already begun to arrive, carrying stories of an impossible battle, of a small nation defying a great empire. Kings and princes marveled. Scholars wrote in awe. The tale would spread, inspiring hope and caution alike. But Stephen thought of the men who would never return to hear those stories. He thought of families grieving, of children growing up without fathers, of villages that had burned in the shadow of approaching armies. The glory of Vaslui could not erase the personal toll. It could not heal the wounds of the living or the dead. He paused at the edge of the valley, looking down at the frozen marshes and snow-streaked fields. Here, the battle had been decided not by sheer numbers, but by understanding, courage, and the willingness to endure suffering. The Ottomans had been defeated because they underestimated the land, the people, and the determination of a prince willing to risk everything. Moldavia had survived, and yet the war was far from over. The Sultan would remember this humiliation. He would not forgive. He would send armies again, larger and more prepared. The cost of defiance was never final. Every victory planted the seeds of future struggle. Every act of courage invited new tests. Stephen turned away from the valley, his face hard but reflective. The snow had hidden the blood. The earth had swallowed the screams, but history would remember. Vaslui was no longer just a battlefield. It was proof that a small nation, armed with knowledge, courage, and resolve, could stand against a mighty empire. As his soldiers prepared to march away, tending the wounded and gathering what remained, Stephen addressed them quietly, not with triumph, but with solemn respect. Today we have done what many said was impossible. We have defended our land, our people, and our honor. But remember, every life lost here is ours to carry. Every scar on this valley is a reminder that survival demands sacrifice. Do not forget that. History will remember Vaslui, but so must we. The men nodded, some with tears, some with quiet acceptance. They had survived the unthinkable, yet they carried memories they would never forget. The valley had taken its due. Victory was theirs, but at a cost that weighed heavily on every heart. Stephen mounted his horse again, feeling the exhaustion in his bones. The road ahead was uncertain. Europe had witnessed courage, and empires had felt fear, but tomorrow the Ottomans would march again. This victory was a pause, not a conclusion. Moldavia had shown the world that resistance was possible, that courage could bend fate, but it had also shown that every act of defiance bore consequences. He looked back one last time. The valley lay quiet, deceptive in its whiteness, holding the dead and the living alike. Snow covered scars, but could not erase them. History would remember Vaslui not only as a battle won, but as a lesson in the price of defiance, in the cost of courage, strategy, and survival against overwhelming odds. Stephen rode forward, leading his men out of the valley. The wind cut across their faces, sharp and unforgiving, but they moved with purpose. Each step was a promise, that Moldavia would endure, that courage mattered, and that even the smallest nation could change the course of history when faced with the mightiest of empires. Vaslui had been more than a victory. It had been a declaration, and the world would remember.